I think we will make a start. So good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is the fourth in a series of lockdown, lowdown interviews that Leeds Civic Trust has been conducting with key figures across the city. My name is Martin Hamilton. I'm the Director of Leeds Civic Trust. I'm delighted this morning to welcome Mark Finch, Director of Real Estate at Rushbond PLC. We're going to start off by asking Mark just to say a little bit about the company he works for and the sort of work that you do, the buildings that you've built, the buildings that you own, etc.
Yeah, that's fine. Good morning, Martin, and good morning, everybody. My name is Mark Finch. I'm the Real Estate Director at Rushbond. A couple of minutes about myself and background. By trade, I'm a chartered surveyor, chartered town planner, studied in Newcastle and Edinburgh, and I've worked in Leeds and the North for probably too many years to count back, but I work for a company called Rushbond. Some of you will be familiar with some of our work, particularly in Leeds. We are a Leeds City region based investor, a real estate investor that owns assets across different sectors, including residential, commercial, food and drink, industrial, through York, Bradford, Skipton, Wakefield, and the city of Leeds. We are particularly, I suppose, renowned or noted for our heritage work, but we do new buildings as well as restore old buildings.
What's your sort of investment approach? I mean, when you decide either to take on, let's say, the Corn Exchange, which you bought relatively recently, or to purchase some land. I'm thinking about the scheme off Marsh Lane, the big piece of land there that you're planning to develop. What sort of thought process do you go through? I mean, obviously you want to make a profit, but what else is part of that consideration?
Yes, it's a good question. It's really because we are, I suppose, fortunate that we're flexible in terms of the sectors. So we look, if you're looking at a piece of, people put pieces of land to us, we look at pieces of land available on the market, we look at buildings, and we think about how we can create value and how that would be, whether it's something to do with the site, something to do with the building, something to do with the wider area, what are the trends in that, and is it a residential scheme, is it, I mean, one example, one work that we did, for instance, the Alf Cook Printworks, which we acquired on Hunslet Road, which was a germ of an idea, kicked off, I think through the city, I think through Phil Crabtree, working the South Bank about an education opportunity. And that led to the creation of the Printworks College. So flexibility across sectors, but just thinking about the dynamic of what's going on in that area and where we could add value. Sometimes it's short term, but more often than not, it's taking a longer term view. And I think if you think, whether you're a developer to hold or a developer to sell, I think if you approach projects with investor mentality, what's right for the long term, that tends to put you in good stead.
Thanks, Mark. Just to say, welcome those of you who joined us while we've been chatting. Please feel free at any point to feed in comments or questions through the chat function on Zoom. I'll try and pick those up as we go along. But we do welcome feedback from what Mark's saying. Mark, Rushbond has been around for 30 odd years, something like that.
Yeah.
So it's a business that has withstood recessions, downturns in fortune in the city, upturns in fortune. It's a local business that has survived. And I guess one of the biggest challenges that we face at the moment is how we respond to COVID-19 across the board, and that's really the theme of these interviews: is how do we face up to a world post COVID-19? And so I wanted to spend a bit of time just talking about some of the issues that that the development world, the property world, might face in the future. Thinking about your business specifically, but the development and property more generally. So I suppose one issue, and I know you wrote an article in the Yorkshire Post a few weeks ago, where you were really emphasising the importance of place as part of the build. It's not just about buildings, but it's about where they're located and the place-making opportunities in and around the building. How do you think that sort of approach is going to have to change? What do you think we need to be looking at in a post-COVID world in terms of not just and we'll maybe come on to the fabric of the buildings in a minute, but the spaces around them? How do you think we need to think about those differently?
Well, I think there's a few observations there. I mean, in terms of the work, you're right, as going through a series of recessions. I can't remember who said it. We probably go 2 or 3 recessions through our career. And in some respects in the north and in Leeds, we work in a climate where values have never necessarily spiked like they do in the southeast, yet the build costs are relatively comparable. We don't kind of experience the ups and lows as dramatic, but we do have to create value, and we do work hard to create value. And there's very few waves that we ride upon, and we're a very resilient sector, and we're a resilient county, I suppose, in terms of how we trying to make things happen. But I think, if anything, through what is climate, this crisis is showcasing to me is the issues that we were facing pre this crisis have just been amplified. It's as though someone's just turned the volume up. There's systematic change on the high street with retailing and online and major chains. That's just been amplified. And particularly around the issue of place. And I think we were already starting to go on the journey of turning away from the motorway cities to a much more pedestrian-friendly place. I always find that, events like, if people have experienced Light Night, it's like Disney-esque. It's as though that the cars are away and the people come out, and people really enjoy the city. And I fully appreciate a city's got to move, but I think a city increasingly has got to play a place for the person and people and pedestrian flow. The city had embarked on a spaces strategy a year or so back, which is if anybody's not read it, it's a very, very good considered piece of work. And I think that just brings that all to the fore. We've seen a lot of the photographs of these beautiful spaces that we've got, and thinking, well, we just want the people back, and then we're less so about the car. It starts to think about, the work that the BID have been doing about logistics, of getting deliveries around, refuse collection, all those practical things have just been amplified. And an opportunity to think, we were already thinking differently, but if we can think differently quicker, I think we'd like, it's been a very sad crisis for many people, but I think it'd be regrettable if we don't take some opportunities to think.
I mean, you mentioned the Our Spaces strategy, Mark, and there's no doubt that that's setting out a really positive agenda for the city centre primarily at the moment, but I know there are ambitions to look at the wider city in the future. So that already was setting out a really ambitious programme for green spaces and public open spaces. But I guess part of that is, what is in public ownership and what is in private ownership, and a lot of that is probably possibly about public land and bringing highways back in, taking highways out of the equation, creating more space, etc. Around the Corn Exchange, for example, which you own. But do you think that you as a developer will need to think differently about how you use your land? So if you think about the land, the footprint that you occupy in a given place, particularly for new build, that actually more space will be needed, less building will be needed in terms of the footprint. Do you think those are things that will need to be considered?
Yeah, I think it's the word partnership is used a lot, and it's been used for many years, but more so really just how a building or a space can feature in that particular area. Not necessarily just the city centre, but also the neighbourhoods and the suburbs, Chapel Allertons, Morley, Pudsey. just thinking about what that place is about. And I think if you think of it as place first, as opposed to sectors, there's a combination of things, isn't there? There's a combination of healthcare services, highways, planning. They're all kind of sometimes dealt with in silos. And I think if we look at things collectively, and principle, I think, is a kind of principle of co-investment. If the private sector seeks to move something forward, what else can happen with, say, the public space or the healthcare environment or the green space to actually improve that? Yes, the importance of space, green space, it has been hugely amplified. I mean, we're going to be fortunate enough to hopefully get the air park in the city. Leeds is blessed with great parks, but they're not necessarily all, in terms of city centre spaces, as green as we would wish. We've seen examples of places like in Bradford with its phenomenal city park, in the Museum Gardens in York, which is a bit of respite from the bustle of a city, are really, really important spaces. And also not only for shoppers or users of the city centre, but obviously residents. How that we've seen alongside, we've got our investment in Brewery Wharf, which is a project we kickstarted many years ago as a piece of placemaking in the city. But we see that the project that Situ are moving forward, which looks incredibly exciting, and that kind of experience and ambience around the waterfront. I think there'll be much more focus on those kind of spaces and places, which in some respects, as a private owner of land, can be difficult to deliver in single small plots. And therefore combining the collective with other investors, other owners, but the local authority and clearly the civic trust and community bodies have a role to play that is pretty vital.
There's a question here about master planning, Mark, I just want to pick up on. And I think this is a question about actually having a person master planning, but I'd probably broaden it out and ask about master planning more generally, because of course we've had pretty unique, actually. We've had a civic architect in Leeds for many years, John Thorpe. So we have had a focus for some of these broader planning issues. But do you think we need to do more on master planning in the city? We have done some work in the South Bank, as you've mentioned, but I'm thinking about your site on Marsh Lane and that East End, for example, of the city centre. There's no particular master plan to plug into to see where you locate within the broader area. Do you think we need to put more work into that in the future?
I suppose it depends what you mean by master planning, and spent many years in working master plans in different areas. If there's a framework for investment, things change. We didn't predict this crisis a year ago, did we? No. Things can happen, and I think the kind of era of kind of a utopian master plan, forensically planned, are beyond us. Frameworks, strategies, systems of dealing with the bits in between, the glue, which is often a public sector role, is really important. But as long as there's flexibility in that structure, whether you call it a framework, whether you call it a vision, or wherever, the hour spaces strategy is quite useful. For instance, in that respect, I wouldn't say it's a master plan, but it provides a toolkit to assess and projects as they come forward. But it's that balance between certainty and flexibility.
Sure. Okay. Mark, I'd like to go back to something that you talked about a few minutes ago, which is really this whole issue around city centre vibrancy. Rushbond own, as I've mentioned, Corn Exchange, retail, if you like, the Majestic office, and then other buildings in the city centre that include residential. So you've got the mixture within the city centre. If COVID-19 has done one thing, it has been to reinforce this issue around where people go for their shopping. More people buying online, more people going local to where they live, maybe fewer people venturing into the city centre. Certainly, very few people venturing into the city centre over the last couple of months. The shops, the non-essential shops, are reopening today. But do you think, what do you think we're going to have to do as a city? What measures do we need to take to retain vibrancy, vitality, and you know, for the city centre to remain a going concern, if you like?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, if we think about offices and workspace, I mean, we think about how well many of us have been able to adapt to work from home, and our houses start to look like mini offices. But conversely, we think about what we're missing. And we're missing that interaction, and we're missing that collaboration, that real productivity input. And we need to think about our offices become more like our homes, the benefits of being able to work with our colleagues. And so if anything, that kind of the office, and perhaps is less of a go to the office, is much more of a choice. Go to the city centre is much more of a choice, because ultimately we're social animals. And although it's great to see you on Zoom today, we can't spend all of our lives in our rooms looking at them. And we need that, and we need a balance. So I think it might start to think about how spaces work. I think there's an real interesting dynamic about localism and thinking locally. You know, we might think globally, we might see what trends are happening out, but we start to think about how we support independence and the things that make our spaces different. Places like Halifax with its Peace Hall, its phenomenal action, something that's really quite unique. The Leeds with its great Victoria Quarter and Victoria Gate and Trinity, and ourselves at the Corn Exchange. So,
you know, taking Victoria Gate, Mark, for example, I mean, that's the sort of high-end offer, if you like, in Leeds in terms of retail. They've been closed down for 3 months. It's never going to be a shopping centre with high footfall. I think it relies on a lower level of footfall, but maybe people buying, you know, bigger ticket items. Do you think that sort of model will survive over the next few years? Do you think people will still come?
Well, we'll find out how many people come back to shops over the next few weeks, but I think so. I think it may be different, and I think local retailers need to think. Certainly how they think about online, and this really kind of, well, it clicks and mortar, whatever you call it, but that experience that we get, there's so many, you know, there's so many things that an online presence can do that's great, but there's so many things it cannot do. And I think that's that yearning to get back and meet people and chat to people and experience the things in the city. It might take time and it might change. And as long as we're alive to that and thinking about the opportunity, then...
I mean, let me just take one example of one of your properties, the Majestic, which, you know, last year, the announcement that Channel 4 were going to take part of the building, great news, the national headquarters, a really impressive building and a really impressive user of that building, and I think we were all delighted that happened. But I mean, I guess I know at the moment you're marketing the building for other tenants to get other people in the rest of the building. But if fewer people are working in the city centre, or at least will only spend maybe part of their time working in the city centre, then potentially fewer offices, fewer desks. Maybe the same space, but maybe fewer people in that space. What does that mean in terms of your financial model, in a way? Because if the business has fewer people using the building, presumably they're not generating as much from that building, therefore they won't be paying as much. So do you think there's going to be a rationalisation in terms of rental payments and that sort of thing?
I mean, property is only one part of running a business. I mean, if you look at the figures that are involved in that, it'd probably be a third at most. I mean, it's staff. It's staff that runs a business, and as property people, we do get obsessed about buildings and things, but then in running a business, it's about how that business can be more productive. It might start to think about the space it needs. It might need more space. It might need more collaboration space. Whether businesses can, a building under, whether it's an headquarters or whether it's your home office, or even with the civic trust in its space, it's the building, it's its brand, and a lot features on that. And this is where I think heritage buildings have a real function to play, because they add that vibrancy and character and difference that actually make people want to come into the office and want to collaborate and be more productive. If businesses are more productive, then they generate more revenue. And so I think businesses start to think about what space they need and the quality and the character of the space and location of that space. And I suspect the cream will rise to the fore. And so some buildings which, if we're honest, some buildings are so dreary that it's a bind to go to the office, and it's those buildings that will have a short shelf life and start to think about its redevelopment opportunity.
Mark, you mentioned heritage buildings, and maybe we can just come on to that, talk a little bit more about that. I mean, as you say, Rushbond have been really they're noted, the company is noted for its investment in heritage buildings, Corn Exchange, Majestic, First Whitecloth Hall, other buildings outside of Leeds as well. These are buildings that people that are synonymous with Leeds. People recognise them, visitors recognise them, and they're part of the wider marketing, if you like, of the city. So I've got two questions. First of all, do you see heritage? I mean, you own some that you're currently working on. First Whitecloth Hall, Mount St Mary's is in your ownership. Do you see heritage buildings as being part of your future as a business? Will you be buying further heritage buildings? Is it part of what you will do in the future, do you think, or will you change? And then I have a second question which I'll come on to, but maybe answer that one first.
Historically, I have been through early projects, Civic Court, and then we've got our residential, Crispin Lofts.
Yeah.
Talked about the Printworks earlier.
Yeah.
It's been aware as an opportunity from a commercial point of view where you can actually create value. Usually you get involved when in a redevelopment sense, obviously when its use has failed. So Printworks closing or a building changing its use, and you start to think about how it's repurposed. That's where there's an interesting dynamic about what it is. Increasingly obviously means about intervention. If you're changing a building's use, like the First Whitecloth Hall, you need to intervene in it. How do you do that? What does it look like? What's acceptable? What's viable? But to try and create that kind of space that, it is the kind of front cover of the marketing for Leeds, isn't it, with the Corn Exchange, and the promotion, because it is such a phenomenally attractive building that resembles the city. In some respects, we think of our role. I mean, these buildings have been there, 200-300 years, where it's a custodianship role. It's got to be commercially viable, and we've got to make something commercially viable. But I think I think they're the lifeblood of the city, and I think they increasingly have that role to play in what makes a city different. So we can start to think, the shift away from, even we talked about retailing 10, 20 years ago. We might think of when I used to go to town as a kid, but I'd go to the same high street in Leeds as I might in Wakefield or as I might in York, or whether it's the same shops. That effort around diversity and localism, and there these buildings have a role to play, I think is significant. We'd like to do more new building alongside, and we certainly do, but I still think the heritage buildings will feature in our portfolio.
The course, heritage buildings do have their problems. As you say, very often, you know, it's a failed project that you take on, or a building that is, you know, stopped being used for its original purpose, maybe, or it has become run down. I mean, Clive here is asking a question really about how can we be quick? How can we move more quickly to save some of these buildings before they go into rack and ruin? You took on First Whitecloth Hall after years of neglect. You know, before you had it, the building, you know, if it had been, if the work that you're doing now had been done 30 years ago, we'd have a very different outcome. How can we try and speed things up to try and get these buildings safe, and B, in use?
Well, on a wider level, I mean, go back to that partnership. I mean, the Cloth Hall is an example of a partnership because working with the city, working with English Heritage, working with the Lottery Fund, there's public support, and just trying to shape a project that can be as viable as you can get it. Increasingly, we've always found with heritage buildings, it's very difficult to perceive what the finished product will look like. So you tend to have to commit to speculative projects. The Majestic, an example. They're very, very difficult to kind of pre-let in the commercial sense, and you have to show people where it could be. And you spend a lot of time, and I know we've spent time looking at the. I think when we picked up the Cloth Hall, there was about 14 or 15 options on the table, and sometimes the planets align on projects where everything's lined up, and there's always a temptation. Well, if you wait another 6 months, perhaps it could be better, or something might run in the corner. But I'm always going to feel if there's a good project there, then take it. So a willing owner, private capital, local authority, they've got toolkit and their powers, and really a focus on a particular asset and where it's failing, how the kind of wider community can help bring something forward.
You talk about you know, the planets aligning, and part of that, part of the one element of this, I guess, is the planning process, which you have to go through when you want to make any changes to an existing building or build something new, I guess. And what we've seen in recent years, for example, is a move to relax some of the rules around change of use. So it's now possible to change an office into residential without planning permission. It's permitted development. There's talk, I know now, of the government moving to a zoning system where an area would be designated, and then pretty much like we had in Leeds 30 odd years ago with the Development Corporation, there will be a panel of worthies, not councillors, not elected people, who would determine planning applications. That's something that apparently the government is looking at again. Do you feel that changes need to be made to the planning process to speed things along, to improve things, and what would they be?
Yeah, no, I'm probably starting into a few personal thoughts now.
It's all right.
I mean, there's a couple of things there. I mean, from a uses classes point of view, I think if you look back at the principles of some uses, and you know, you put houses, and you have industry, and you have commerce, and they shouldn't mix, because industry shouldn't be alongside housing, and the whole principles of use classes, I think, has moved on. You know, the world's moved on. It's much more mixed, and I think there is a legitimate role for, you know, a retail shop that no longer functions. Could be a leisure, or could be an office. I think there can be greater flexibility on that within parameters of environmental protection. I think generally the planning system is, I mean, there's an issue of resource. There's always been an issue of resource. I'm not sure, and it does take time. At the end of the day, planning process is there, I suppose, to regulate and get a good project through, and it's a complex process, and it's an expensive process, but it's there to try to get, most authorities in my experience are there to be proactive and make development happen. It's just some of the departments have been stretched, over years, and I think that is an issue. So I think there's scope for greater flexibility and speed, but there's also scope for greater investment in the system.
Just one example that we saw recently at the trust of a building, a fairly well-known building, Westgate Point, as you come into Leeds from the west onto the Headrow. There's a permitted development application in to convert that from offices, as it is at the moment, to residential. Very little the council can do to stop it happening. There are 2 or 3 very narrow areas that they can look at in terms of flood risk and that sort of thing. But essentially, it will go through. But you look at the size of the potential units, and they're tiny. The corridors are narrow. There's no public amenity space. There's no obvious place to park bicycles, let alone having the usual requirements on parking. So, an example like that of what is currently allowed seems to us to be crazy, actually. How do you think those sorts of issues, whilst certainly allowing for speed and allowing for things to be moved through quickly, do you not think that those issues are still important in doing those conversions?
I mean, I can only talk really from my own how we approach projects and experience them, and ultimately, I'm thinking about how we sell the space and how we let the space. I'm seeing increasingly demand for, and in some respects, in this crisis will exacerbate or accelerate that trend around space. We're also downsizing sector of the market, requirements for space within the buildings. You might want a 1-bedroom flat, but you want your grandkids to stay, or you want a spare room, or you want an office at home. You want a great space. So I think there's a change in dynamics. Certainly, we're picking up about the type of spaces that we want to create, and the markets to respond to that. And I think there's trends there. There's a huge pent-up demand, if we're honest, in terms of the housing sector. A lot of our stock in all of our cities is old. We need to think about reusing stock. I mean, that's the most sustainable thing we can do, and retrofitting and upgrading stock. But ultimately, think about the space that we need to let and sell to make a project viable. And that's how I would approach a project.
I mean, you are actually a house builder, as well as the variety of uses that you have is unusual, I suspect. But you also are a house builder. You've built houses in Wortley.
Yes.
You've got a site, Stonebridge Mills. What has the process of building those houses told you about? I mean, they clearly have been. They appear to be successful. People have bought them. They're not your standard mass builder sort of fare, are they? So what was the approach you took there?
Yeah, I mean, the project in Wortley and Greenhill Fold is a really interesting one. I mean, it's 49 properties from memory. It was going to be in 2 phases, but it took off and we just did it in 1 phase. And I spent some time in Wortley in that community, and there was a great community. And you think, if you can create that kind of great product, we had a mix. So we had the junior and infant school. Actually, from the top floor of the high level of the junior school, you have got a fantastic view over the city from the west. So we flipped the properties, so the living rooms were at the top floor with that views, and then the new homes were just done contemporarily with a twist. Good family homes, keeping the price affordable, and there's a lovely little community that we created up there. I remember going into the sales office of Selling the Last One, and they were having events and parties across the group, and made a real difference to that site in that. And similarly, we're fortunate to get consent for Stonebridge Mills, which is a project we've been working on to create that destination. We did a project in Bootham in York, Bootham Green, which was taking the old school and adding on the contemporary twist, and it was just creating something different. and creating that sense of community. Yeah, we'd love to do more of those projects.
Talking about working in the outside of the city centre, I've got a question here about this is slightly going back to what we were talking about earlier about office space. Do you think there's an opportunity maybe to look more creatively at some of the old buildings that are dotted around the city, and maybe not just think about purely residential, but maybe think about a mixed use co-working opportunities? If people aren't going to want to go in the city centre, but they want somewhere to work that is near to where they live, maybe a converted mill for co-working, for example. Do you think that's part of the future?
We're creating that mix, and we've just finished a project in Skipton, Bellevue Mills, with the cotton mill, and there, I think there's an article about it in the Yorkshire Post last weekend, actually. Attractiveness as a place to live, but also with office and leisure and other spaces on your doorstep. The idea of space where you might want to make things as well as just type away the laptop or be on Zoom. And those increasingly important, that kind of space, a different hierarchy really. And I think those Leeds, whether neighbourhood's the right expression, it sounds quite American, doesn't it, a neighbourhood, but kind of Leeds is made up of a collection of places. It's not just all about the city centre, and each one's very, very diverse and different. Garforth and Otley and Morley poles apart in some respects, but they're consistent in others. And I think we start to think about how we support, how housing sites support that area. And I think that's important for when we think about where investing. You're investing in a Wortley or investing in Stonebridge. It's what's that wider? Why would you want to live there? And connect into, and what's the bits that's missing? So I think there's a lot of thought and going about. It comes back to this point we were talking, Martin, about the issue about place and thinking about that place first, and then how we collaborate. It's interesting. We had there was the city run a great program on inclusive growth recently involved in, and all the things that make up place, and all the people are doing, and cultural organisations and health organisations are all doing phenomenally great work. But it's very hard to bring everybody together.
Yes.
Areas it's hard. It just is hard because that's I'm a developer. I develop, and I do my own thing. I've got my own day job in a way. But if we start to think that way and how we can actually facilitate those conversations, I think we get a richer tapestry of projects and focus and heritage, and the civic trust's input into that is actually invariably key. Whether there is the project we worked on York Road Library in the Bermontoft community. I think it's possibly the only listed building left in that area, unfortunately. I might be wrong, but it's quite symbolic. And if it's lost, then that is lost.
We've got about 5 minutes left, and there's a couple of things I'd like to finish off with. Just one very quick one, just to throw in, which is student accommodation, because I know you have had some involvement in the past in student accommodation. We've seen a massive growth in private accommodation in Leeds city centre in the last 3-4 years, really. Most of it clustered around the Merrion Centre. There are doubts now about whether the students are going to come back certainly this year in the numbers that were expected. International students may be put off coming to the UK altogether. And it comes back to this issue of flexibility. Building something for one purpose, but being able to use it for something else. Because we have thousands of student bedrooms in the pipeline, and maybe not the students to go in them. How do you think that's going to play out?
Well, we have done. I mean, from our perspective, and only talk from our perspective, we did Algernon Firth was a building that was saved in Leeds, which was converted to students, and certainly through the design process is thinking, well, if that market doesn't materialise, could there be apartments? Could there be something else? And even thinking about if a building in 30, 40, 50 years' time changes use. So we've got ourselves in that sector, and increasingly that sector has become quite, there's a big focus about the management of space and the operation of that space, and it's not something we particularly specialise in. So we no longer own that asset, but did the development that work.
But that's a building that could be altered and put to a different use.
Oh yeah, I suppose it definitely could, and it's trying that flexibility. It goes back to a point about if you think with an investor that in 30, 40 years time, you don't want to be left with a building that you have to knock down in order to repurpose or reuse, ideally. And we've seen a lot of buildings built in the last 20, 30 years in our cities that are really just a single purpose building.
Yeah.
And if it fails, and we see some examples of them, then they just stand there waiting for the demolition.
Absolutely, yeah. No, that's an interesting point about and again, converting existing buildings. It's been something else. You convert it to something else, but then you think about its life in the future. I think it's part of an evolution, isn't it? Of a building. It's not about having something fixed for 30 years and then potentially, you can't do anything with it. Mark, last couple of things I wanted to talk about then. There's been an announcement that there will be an elected mayor for West Yorkshire, so next year, and I know you take part in some of these citywide discussions on issues through various bodies. What do you think the position of elected mayor for West Yorkshire? What opportunities does that create for the city that we don't have at the moment, do you think?
Well, I think there's a big, I can't say professing to be an expert on devolution deals, and there's others that know more about that. But I think in terms of ability to control your own destiny and local decisions and local financing of projects is incredibly significant. And I think that gives into coming back to intervening in areas about public and private sector and the bits of the glue, whether it be a highway or a rail link or public space. The development industry needs that public sector support, and those decisions, if they can be taken locally, must be the place to take. And the role then of how that mayor will shape and for what geography. But I suppose being more that regional local focus really, and so I think if we see our places as a series of on different levels of whether it be neighbourhood or whether it be suburb or whether it be city centre or whether it be regional, we can think on those layers, and we think about what's best for the city region and our county and the north. And it's clearly there's a lot of different dynamics in play than there are in parts of the UK.
You're not putting forward yourself as a possible candidate, are you, Mark?
It's like a political answer, really, doesn't it? Actually,
yeah. I'm just thinking you might be thinking that sounded like the answer of someone that might be standing.
No. I think it's and if those decisions are made locally and they help your project, great. If they don't help your project, then you have to accept that.
Yeah.
Local decisions made in that way.
Last question, very, very briefly, because we are out of time now. We're likely to go into a recession. The country is likely to go into a deep recession as we come out of COVID. Leeds will be competing with other similar cities for a slice of whatever the cake is that is available out there. What would you say to investors, to people that are still interested in putting money into our cities? What would you say that Leeds, what is Leeds' USP? What's our unique selling point, would you say?
I think all of the cities across the north are very different. Manchester, Liverpool, Hull, Leeds is a very different place. It's a very different place to Manchester. It's a compact city. It's a city that's got great stakeholders, a forward-looking local authority, great people to work with and collaborate. You've got to learn the city. I suspect some time spent in it and working with it and being positive. And the people that make it up, which you will only ever experience by being in the city or investing in the city and working with people. and you see that it's exemplified in things like the Tour of Yorkshire, the Light Night. I mean, it's regrettable that we can't have these things this year, but they'll be back. And they give a sign of what I think. That's why things like the Welcome to Yorkshire around the tour have been great, because they show what the city's about as a people place, and it's diverse. And whether we I'll leave it to the economists to look at growth levels and where that sits. I always think that UK levels are skewed by one particular part of this country, and if we take that out, we might get a different flavour. But we can all kind of do our best and be humble about what we can and what we can't do, and make the most of the potential. I think there are a few areas that we've touched on about place. We haven't spoken about air quality and transport too much, but that's something as well that fits into that dynamic, and about making our city a more livable space, which makes it ultimately, I think, more investable.
Mark, we're out of time. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. I found that fascinating, and we've actually covered a lot of ground there. And I think your perspective as a developer on some of these issues is a really interesting one. So, thank you very much for joining us, and thank you everyone for listening in. I hope you found the discussion interesting. Just to say that on Friday we have an interview with Stuart Andrew MP, the MP for Pudsey. So if you'd like to join in that discussion, then please register via Eventbrite. And then on Monday, a week today, we have Andrew Cooper, the CEO of the Leeds Bid, giving the business and city centre perspective on what we need to do post-COVID. So those are the last two interviews we have on the books. We may have some more coming forward later on. But Mark, thank you very much. That was really good. Thank you for listening, and have a nice rest of the day. Thank you.
Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.